The moment I heard that the HOA had harassed my sister at the ranch gate, claiming they forgot I owned the whole valley, I knew everything was about to change. My phone was still buzzing against my ear when Sarah's voice cracked through the speaker, barely holding back tears. They blocked me, David. Actually blocked me with their cars at our own gate. Her words hit me like a physical blow. 3 of them just sitting there in their pristine SUVs, telling me I need permission to enter my own family's ranch. I was sitting in my downtown office, staring at quarterly reports that suddenly seemed meaningless. The ranch. Our ranch. The same gate I'd walked through as a kid, chasing cattle with my grandfather, learning to rope from my father. The same gate that had welcomed 5 generations of our family. What do you mean, permission? The question came out harder than I intended. Sarah, tell me exactly what happened. The HOA president, this woman named Margaret Thornfield, she had this clipboard and everything, started reading from some official-looking document about community compliance and unauthorized agricultural activities. Sarah's breathing was shaky now. She said the ranch violates their new aesthetic standards for the valley. Can you believe that? Our ranch, David. The ranch that was here before any of their cookie-cutter mansions existed. I felt something dark and cold settle in my chest. 20 years I'd been away, building my tech company in the city, but I'd kept every acre of our family's land. Every single acre. The ranch wasn't just property to us. It was legacy, blood, and generations of sweat equity rolled into 3,000 acres of prime valley floor. She actually had the nerve to hand me an eviction notice, Sarah continued, her voice getting stronger with anger now. Said I had 30 days to cease and desist all ranching operations or face legal action. I tried to explain that we own the land, that we've been here since the 1890s, but she just smiled this condescending smile and said property ownership doesn't override community standards. I was already reaching for my keys. Sarah, are you safe right now? I'm at the ranch house, but David, I'm scared. They had this look in their eyes like they owned the place. Like we were the intruders. Her voice dropped to a whisper. What if they're right? What if there's some legal loophole I don't understand? What if we actually could lose the ranch? The ranch wasn't just land to Sarah. It was her whole world. After Mom and Dad died, she'd moved out here full-time, managing the cattle operation, maintaining the buildings, keeping our family's legacy alive while I played corporate games in glass towers. She deserved better than being intimidated by suburban bullies with manufactured authority. Listen to me very carefully, I said, standing up and grabbing my jacket. They're not right. They can't be right. But I need you to document everything. Every conversation, every piece of paper they gave you, every person who was there. Can you do that for me? Already started. I took pictures of their cars blocking the gate, recorded part of the conversation on my phone. Sarah was thinking like the rancher she'd become, practical, thorough, ready for a fight. But David, what if they come back? What if they try to physically remove me? That's when I felt it, that protective rage that only comes when someone threatens family. These HOA people had no idea what they'd just stepped into. They saw a vulnerable woman alone on a ranch and thought they could push her around. They thought they could intimidate their way to whatever twisted goal they had in mind. They had absolutely no clue that their little power play had just awakened something they really, really should have left sleeping. Sarah, I want you to lock the gates and don't let anyone on the property until I get there. I'm driving out tonight. I was already walking toward the elevator, my mind racing through possibilities and legal strategies. And Sarah? This isn't over. Not even close. Because here's what Margaret Thornfield and her HOA cronies didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have researched before they decided to play their little intimidation game. I didn't just own our family ranch. The 3-hour drive to the ranch gave me plenty of time to think about how we'd gotten here, and more importantly, why these HOA people had picked the wrong family to mess with. See, most people looking at Clearwater Valley today would see the sprawling McMansions dotting the hillsides, the perfectly manicured HOA communities with their identical mailboxes and covenant-controlled landscaping. They'd assume this was always some upscale suburban paradise. They'd be dead wrong. My great-great-grandfather, Samuel Harrison, bought the first 1,000 acres in 1894 for practically nothing because nobody wanted high desert ranch land back then. Too far from town, too harsh for farming, too wild for civilized folks. But Samuel saw what others didn't: water rights, grazing potential, and room to build something lasting. By the time my grandfather inherited the spread, we owned nearly the entire valley floor. Not just the ranch itself, but the mineral rights, water rights, and every acre of what would eventually become some of the most valuable real estate in 3 counties. Grandpa was smart. He never sold, only bought more when neighboring homesteaders gave up and moved on. "Never sell the land, boy," he used to tell me while we fixed fence line together. "Money comes and goes, but land is forever. This valley will take care of your family long after I'm gone." He was right, but not in the way either of us expected. When Teak took off in the early 2000s, I built my software company from the ground up, working 18-hour days and living on coffee and determination. The ranch supported me through those lean startup years. We leased grazing rights to neighboring ranchers, sold hay, anything to keep both the business and the family legacy alive. As my company grew and eventually went public, developers started sniffing around the valley. The location was perfect, close enough to the city for commuters, but far enough out to feel rural and exclusive. One by one, they approached me with offers. Serious money, life-changing money. I turned them all down. But here's where it gets interesting: I didn't turn down everything. When developers wanted to build their luxury communities on the surrounding hillsides, land that wasn't part of our original ranch, I was willing to sell. At premium prices, of course. Always keeping the valley floor, always keeping the water rights, always keeping the core of what made this place special. Sarah thought I was crazy. "David, we could retire on what they're offering for just the south pasture." "We're not selling the heart of this place," I told her. "But we can profit from its growth without destroying what matters." So I sold them the hillside parcels, dozens of them over the years. Enough land for 3 separate HOA communities, all perched up on the ridges, looking down at our ranch like vultures eyeing a carcass. I kept detailed records of every transaction, every easement, every covenant that came with those sales. What I didn't anticipate was how those HOA communities would evolve. How they'd elect little tyrants like Margaret Thornfield, who'd get drunk on their microscopic authority. How they'd start viewing the valley as their domain, our ranch as an eyesore that needed to be controlled or eliminated. They looked at our cattle operation, our working barns, our utilitarian ranch buildings, and saw problems to be solved, rather than the foundation everything else was built upon. They wanted a sanitized, Instagram-perfect valley where the messiness of actual agriculture didn't interfere with their property values. Sarah had been reporting their escalating complaints for months. First, it was the unsightly hay storage. Then they objected to cattle trucks using the valley road. Next came complaints about the odors from our composting operation. Each time, I'd told Sarah to ignore them. They had no legal authority over our property. I was right about the legal authority part. I was wrong about ignoring them. Because while I was dismissing their complaints as suburban nonsense, they were organizing, building coalitions, electing board members who shared their vision of a ranch-free valley. They were treating this like a war, and I'd been treating it like a minor annoyance. The worst part, Sarah had told me during one of our phone calls, is how they make me feel like I'm doing something wrong. Like keeping cattle and growing hay is somehow offensive to civilized people. That's what really got to me, not their legal overreach, but the psychological warfare they were waging against my sister. Sarah had given up her city job, her social life, her dating prospects, everything to keep our family legacy alive. She deserved respect for that sacrifice, not harassment from people who wouldn't know a Holstein from a Hereford. As I drove through the darkness toward the valley, passing the first HOA community's pretentious stone entrance gates, I realized something that should have occurred to me years earlier. These people had been buying their little pieces of paradise from me without ever bothering to research who they were really dealing with. They saw my willingness to sell as weakness, my distance as absence, my sister's vulnerability as opportunity. They were about to learn that patience isn't the same thing as powerlessness. I arrived at the ranch just after midnight, but I didn't go to the house. Instead, I parked at the gate where they'd blocked Sarah earlier and just sat there in the darkness, staring at our family's brand burned into the wooden gatepost. 5 generations of Harrisons had passed through this entrance. Now some suburban committee thought they could close it. The next morning, I called Margaret Thornfield directly. Time for introductions. Mrs. Thornfield, this is David Harrison. I understand you had an interaction with my sister yesterday that needs clarification. Her voice had that practiced sweetness that barely concealed sharp edges underneath. Oh, Mr. Harrison, I'm so glad you called. We've been trying to reach the property owner for months. Your sister has been uncooperative with our community improvement initiatives. Community improvement? I kept my tone level. Professional. Help me understand what community authority you have over private ranch land. Well, the Clearwater Valley Homeowners Association represents all property owners in the valley. We have a responsibility to maintain standards that protect everyone's investment. She was reading from something probably the same script she'd used on Sarah. Frankly, Mr. Harrison, agricultural operations of this scale are no longer appropriate for our community's evolution. There it was. Evolution, like our ranch was some primitive phase they'd grown beyond. I'd like to meet with you and your board, I said. This afternoon, if possible. There seems to be some confusion about property rights that we should clear up in person. Of course. We meet at the Ridgeview Community Center at 2. I'll put you on the agenda. Ridgeview Community Center. Built on land I'd sold them 5 years ago. I spent the morning with Sarah, walking the property and documenting everything. The hay barn they called unsightly, built by my grandfather in 1952, solid as a mountain. The cattle operation they found offensive, sustainably managed grass-fed beef that supplied 3 local restaurants, the odorous composting area, an environmentally responsible waste management system that most commercial operations would envy. You don't have to do this alone, Sarah said, as we stood looking out over the south pasture where Angus cattle grazed peacefully. I can handle Margaret and her committee. You shouldn't have to handle anything, I replied. This isn't your fight, it's mine. I'm the one who sold them the land they're standing on to intimidate you. I reminded them of that. The Ridgeview Community Center was exactly what I expected, all glass and steel and architectural pretension, designed to look important rather than actually be useful. I arrived 15 minutes early and took a seat in the back, watching board members file in with their manila folders and self-important expressions. Margaret Thornfield was easy to spot mid-50s, perfectly styled silver hair, the kind of woman who'd never gotten dirt under her manicured nails, but had strong opinions about people who did. She was holding court with 2 other board members, gesturing toward some kind of presentation materials. When she called the meeting to order, I counted 12 people in attendance. All residents of the 3 HOA communities surrounding our ranch. All looking at me like I was some curiosity that had wandered into their civilized proceedings. Our first agenda item, Margaret announced, is the ongoing compliance issue with the Harrison Ranch property. We have David Harrison here today to discuss resolution of this matter. I stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch a beat longer than comfortable. Thank you for accommodating this meeting, Mrs. Thornfield. I think there may be some fundamental misunderstandings we need to address. Please, call me Margaret. That practiced smile again. We're all neighbors here, after all. Now, I know change can be difficult, but the valley has evolved considerably since your family's earlier operations. We're simply asking for cooperation in maintaining the community standards that protect all of our property values. Help me understand those standards, I said. Specifically, what authority your association has over land it doesn't own. Margaret exchanged glances with the other board members. Well, the HOA represents the interests of Valley residents. While we can't legally control your property directly, we can certainly advocate for changes that benefit the community as a whole. Advocate is different from blocking gates and issuing eviction notices. Now, I think eviction is a strong word. It's the word your notice used yesterday. I pulled out my phone and read directly from Sarah's photo. Quote, failure to cease and desist all ranching operations within 30 days will result in legal action to remove unauthorized agricultural activities from Clearwater Valley. End quote. The room got very quiet. Margaret's smile faltered for the first time. Mr. Harrison, surely you understand that agricultural operations of this scale affect everyone's quality of life. Property values, traffic patterns, even health considerations from dust and odors. So your solution is to eliminate ranching entirely? Our solution is modernization. The valley has transitioned to residential use. Your property represents significant development potential that could benefit everyone. Margaret was getting more confident now, back on script. We're prepared to facilitate discussions with several reputable developers who specialize in luxury residential communities. There it was. The real agenda. They didn't just want to control the ranch, they wanted to eliminate it entirely and cash in on development rights. I see. I nodded thoughtfully. So this isn't really about community standards. This is about forcing a sale. This is about progress, Mr. Harrison. About recognizing that the valley's highest and best use has evolved beyond agricultural purposes. I looked around the room at their expectant faces. They thought they had me cornered. Thought I was some absentee owner who'd fold under pressure and sell to the first developer who waved enough cash. Well, I said finally, I appreciate your directness about your goals. It helps clarify the situation considerably. Margaret smiled triumphantly. I'm so glad we understand each other. Change is never easy, but with cooperation. Oh, we definitely understand each other now, I interrupted. The question is whether you understand the situation you've created. Her smile froze. Excuse me? You're trying to intimidate my family off land we've owned for over a century. You're issuing ultimatums about property you have no legal authority over. You're essentially demanding we abandon our livelihood for your financial benefit. I let that sink in for a moment. Did I miss anything? Mr. Harrison, I think you're mischaracterizing. Am I? I stood up to leave. Then let me be as direct as you've been, Margaret. My family isn't selling. We're not abandoning the ranch. And we're certainly not taking orders from a suburban HOA about how to use our own land. The room erupted in whispered conversations as I headed for the door. Mr. Harrison, Margaret's voice had lost all pretense of sweetness. This isn't over. The community has rights, and we will protect them. I stopped at the door and looked back at her. You know what, Margaret? You're absolutely right. This isn't over. But as I drove home, I realized they'd made this much easier than I'd expected. They'd shown their cards completely forced sale, development profits, elimination of the ranch. No pretense about community standards or property rights. They wanted a war over control of the valley. Margaret Thornfield wasn't kidding when she said it wasn't over. Within a week of our meeting, the harassment escalated from annoying to genuinely dangerous. It started with the feed delivery truck. Sarah called me Tuesday morning, her voice tight with frustration. They blocked the county road access again. 3 cars parked right across the cattle guard, claiming there's some kind of traffic safety concern about commercial vehicles. What did the driver do? Waited 2 hours, then left. Said he couldn't afford to sit there all day playing games with suburban vigilantes. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. David, that's our winter feed order. If we can't get deliveries through. I felt that familiar surge of protective anger. What about the sheriff? Did you call them? Deputy Martinez came out, but by the time he got here, the cars were gone. Margaret showed up instead with some county official I'd never seen before, claimed they were conducting a road usage assessment for community safety. The brilliance of their strategy was becoming clear. They couldn't legally stop us from operating the ranch, but they could make it practically impossible through bureaucratic warfare and coordinated harassment. Death by 1,000 cuts. By Thursday, it got worse. Sarah's voice was barely controlled when she called. They're targeting our workers now. Miguel couldn't get to the barn this morning. Someone had chained the employee gate shut overnight. When he tried to climb over, 3 HOA residents showed up claiming he was trespassing. Miguel's been working for us for 12 years, I said, gripping the phone harder than necessary. He has every right to be on our property. Try telling that to Margaret's enforcement committee. They demanded to see his authorization and threatened to call immigration if he didn't leave immediately. Sarah's anger was finally breaking through her usual calm. David, they made Miguel cry. This proud man who's worked harder than any of them will ever work, and they reduced him to tears with their racist intimidation tactics. That crossed a line. Targeting Sarah was bad enough, but going after our employees, people who depended on us for their livelihoods, was beyond harassment. It was economic warfare designed to collapse our operation from within. I decided to try a different approach. Maybe reason would work where confrontation had failed. Friday morning, I called Margaret again. We need to find a middle ground here. This escalation isn't helping anyone. Oh, I completely agree, she said, back to that saccharine tone. In fact, we've been discussing compromise solutions with the board. We're prepared to be quite reasonable. I'm listening. Well, we understand you have sentimental attachment to the property. What if we designated, say, 5 acres around the original homestead as a historical preserve? You could maintain the house and maybe a small garden. Very quaint, very respectful of your family's heritage. 5 acres out of 3,000. And the rest would be developed appropriately for residential use. The board has identified several firms that specialize in sensitive development projects. You'd retain ownership of the historical section, of course, and receive fair market value for the development parcels. Fair market value determined by whom? Well, the HOA would need to approve the appraisal process to ensure community interests are protected. But I'm sure we could reach an equitable arrangement. I almost laughed. They wanted me to sell 2,995 acres at prices they would determine, keeping only enough land for a museum display of our former ranch. All wrapped in language about compromise and historical preservation. Margaret, that's not a compromise, that's surrender with extra steps. Her tone sharpened immediately. Mr. Harrison, we're trying to be reasonable here. But the community has spoken clearly about the direction they want the valley to take. Agricultural operations are simply incompatible with residential development at this scale. Then maybe residential development shouldn't have been built in an agricultural valley. The valley has evolved, whether you acknowledge it or not. Fighting that evolution will only make things more difficult for everyone involved. Is that a threat? It's a reality. Community pressure can be persistent when residents feel their interests aren't being respected. After I hung up, I sat in my office, staring out at the city skyline, thinking about persistence. They were right about one thing: they were persistent. Every day brought new creative forms of harassment designed to make Sarah's life unbearable. The mail started arriving at the ranch instead of Sarah's P.O. box, dozens of complaints from concerned citizens about everything from noise levels to water usage to the environmental impact of cattle grazing. All copied to various county agencies, creating a paper trail of alleged violations that required Sarah to respond to endless bureaucratic inquiries. Then came the surprise inspections. Building code enforcement showed up unannounced to examine barn structures that had been grandfathered for decades. The health department wanted to inspect our water wells after reports of contamination concerns. Fire safety officials questioned our hay storage procedures following anonymous tips about fire hazards. Each inspection turned up nothing, but each one cost Sarah hours of work, stress, and time away from actually running the ranch. The message was clear: comply with our demands or face bureaucratic hell until you break. The final straw came on a Sunday morning. Sarah called, and for the first time since this started, she sounded defeated. "David, they got to the bank." "What do you mean they got to the bank?" "Our operating loan. The one we renew every year for seasonal expenses. Suddenly, there are concerns about the agricultural viability of our location." Margaret Thornfield apparently sits on some advisory committee that reviews commercial lending in the county. Sarah's voice was hollow. "They're not denying the loan exactly, but they want additional environmental assessments, land use studies, community impact reports. It'll take months and cost thousands of dollars we don't have." That's when I realized Margaret's true genius. She wasn't just some suburban tyrant drunk on HOA power. She was systematically using her network of connections, county officials, bank committees, regulatory agencies to strangle our operation through legitimate bureaucratic channels. She turned the entire local government apparatus into her personal weapon against our family. "Sarah, pack a bag and come stay in the city for a few days." "What? No, I'm not abandoning the ranch." "You're not abandoning anything, but I need some time to research our options without worrying about your safety." Because that's what this had become: a safety issue. Margaret's community pressure was escalating beyond harassment into something that could turn physically dangerous. "David, if I leave now, they win. They'll probably have the gates padlocked by the time I get back." She was right. But I also couldn't let her stay there alone while I figured out how to fight an enemy who'd weaponized the entire bureaucratic system against us. "Give me 48 hours, I said. "Stay on the property, don't engage with any of them, and document everything. But if anything feels unsafe, anything at all, you call me immediately." "What are you going to do?" I was already pulling up legal databases on my computer, searching for property rights attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. Something I should have done from the beginning. I'm going to find out exactly what weapons we have in this fight. Because Margaret Thornfield had made one critical miscalculation in her campaign of bureaucratic warfare. She assumed I'd been passive out of weakness rather than restraint. The property records office in the county courthouse had that musty smell of old paper and forgotten bureaucracy. I'd been there since they opened Monday morning, working through decades of land transactions with the kind of methodical patience I usually reserved for debugging complex software. Most people would have hired a team of lawyers and researchers for this kind of deep dive. But I'd learned long ago that when you really need to understand something, you do the work yourself. Every deed, every easement, Every mineral rights transfer, I was building a complete picture of who owned what in Clearwater Valley. And what I was discovering was going to change everything. Find something interesting? The clerk, an older woman named Dorothy, who'd worked here for 30 years, peered over my shoulder at the survey maps I had spread across the table. You could say that. I pointed to a 1,987 deed transfer, highlighted in yellow. This mineral rights reservation, it covers a lot more territory than I remembered. Dorothy squinted at the legal description. Oh, that's the old Harrison tract. Your family, right? I remember your grandfather coming in here. Must have been the early 90s. Very particular about making sure all his mineral rights stayed intact. My grandfather. The man who taught me that land was forever, but never explained exactly how much forever he'd secured for our family. By noon, I had the full picture. 3 bankers' boxes worth of documentation that told a story Margaret Thornfield clearly hadn't bothered to research before she started her little war. The Harrison family didn't just own the ranch. We owned the mineral rights under most of the valley. We owned the water rights that supplied the entire area. And most importantly, we owned something called access easements that guaranteed our right to cross any property in the valley for agricultural purposes. But that wasn't even the best part. I called my attorney, James Fletcher, from the courthouse steps. Jim, I need you to clear your afternoon. We have some research to verify and a strategy to plan. This about your HOA problem? I have to warn you, David, these community associations can be pretty creative with harassment tactics. Even when they're legally wrong, they can make life miserable while you fight them. Jim, what I'm about to show you is going to change how we think about this entire situation. His downtown office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, but all afternoon we focused on papers spread across his conference table. Jim's expression grew more amazed with each document I showed him. David, are you telling me you own the water rights for the entire valley, including the wells that supply all 3 HOA communities? Not just the rights, the actual aquifer access points. Every community well draws from groundwater that flows through our property first. I pulled out a geological survey from 1994. My grandfather had this commissioned when he was worried about development affecting our water supply. Jim was already making notes. So theoretically, you could restrict their access to water? Theoretically, but it gets better. I showed him the easement documents. These access rights were written into every property deed when I sold those hillside parcels. Legal language guaranteeing agricultural vehicle access across any developed property in the valley. Which means every time they blocked our feed trucks or prevented our workers from reaching the ranch, they violated legally binding easements that they agreed to when they bought their properties. Jim leaned back in his chair, grinning like a shark who'd just spotted wounded prey. David, this is beautiful. They've been fighting a war where they don't control any of the strategic resources. But I wasn't finished. There's one more thing. The mineral rights include subsurface access for agricultural and industrial purposes. I never really thought about what that meant until today. And now? I pulled out the final document, a geological survey that had been gathering dust in my grandfather's files for 30 years. Jim, there's a natural gas deposit under the south pasture that nobody's ever developed. Small scale, not worth commercial extraction back in the day. But with modern technology. Jim's eyes widened. You could permit drilling operations right in the middle of their pristine residential paradise. Completely legal, completely protected by mineral rights that predate all of their property deeds. I was starting to enjoy this. Margaret wants to talk about community standards and property values. Wait until she sees how industrial gas extraction affects her view. We spent the rest of the afternoon developing strategy. Not just legal defense, but comprehensive offense designed to remind Margaret Thornfield and her HOA cronies exactly who held the real power in this valley. The beauty of this approach, Jim explained as we outlined our plan, is that everything we're discussing is completely legal. We're not harassing anyone or breaking any laws. We're simply exercising property rights that have been legally established for decades. But it will get their attention. Oh, it'll do more than that. David, when they realize the scope of what you actually control, this little HOA rebellion is going to collapse faster than a house of cards. That evening, I called Sarah with an update. For the first time in weeks, she sounded hopeful. So we're really going to fight back? Not just defend, but actually take the offensive? Sarah, what I learned today changes everything. Margaret and her friends picked a fight with someone they assumed was powerless. They're about to discover that assumption was catastrophically wrong. What do you need me to do? First, document everything they've done. Every block delivery, every harassment incident, every bureaucratic game they've played. We're going to need that evidence. I was already making lists of calls to make tomorrow. Second, start reaching out to our neighbors, the real ranchers and longtime residents who've been watching this HOA takeover with growing concern. It's time they understood what's really at stake here. And third, prepare for Margaret Thornfield to discover that intimidation works both ways. She spent months making your life hell through bureaucratic warfare. Tomorrow, she's going to learn what real bureaucratic warfare looks like when someone who actually understands the system decides to play hardball. I hung up and spent another hour reviewing Jim's strategy notes. Margaret had been smart, using her network of connections to weaponize local government against us. But she'd made one critical error in her research. She had assumed that because I'd been absent from the valley, I was uninformed about my rights and powerless to fight back. She'd never considered the possibility that my absence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. 20 years building a technology company had taught me things about information warfare, strategic planning, and systematic problem-solving that Margaret's suburban HOA experience couldn't match. Tomorrow morning, I was going to start applying those lessons to our little valley dispute. And Margaret Thornfield was going to discover that there's a big difference between bullying a vulnerable woman, living alone on a ranch, and taking on someone who'd spent decades learning how to destroy much larger opponents in much more complex battles. The emergency HOA meeting was Margaret's idea, but I made sure it would be on my terms. When she called that Thursday morning, her voice had that brittle edge of someone who thought they were delivering a killing blow. Mr. Harrison, the board has voted to pursue immediate legal action regarding your family's continued non-compliance with community standards. We're calling an emergency meeting tonight at 7 to finalize our resolution. What kind of resolution, Margaret? A formal demand for cessation of all agricultural activities, backed by court injunction proceedings. We have documented evidence of ongoing violations that endanger community welfare. She was reading from something again, probably a script her attorney had prepared. Your presence is requested but not required. Oh, I'll be there, I said. In fact, I insist on being placed first on the agenda. That's unusual. Emergency meetings typically don't include public comment periods. Margaret, trust me on this one. You're going to want to hear what I have to say before you finalize anything. There was a pause. Fine, but we're limiting your time to 10 minutes. I'll only need 5. That afternoon, I made my final preparations. Jim Fletcher had spent 3 days preparing a presentation that would, in his words, permanently end this dispute. I'd had multiple conversations with county officials, state regulatory agencies, and several industrial contractors. Everything was in place. The Ridgeview Community Center was packed when I arrived. Word had spread through all 3 HOA communities that tonight would be the final showdown with the Harrison Ranch. I counted at least 60 people in attendance, more than I'd ever seen at a Valley gathering. Margaret had clearly orchestrated this for maximum impact. She'd positioned herself at the head table with 4 other board members, all wearing matching navy blazers like some kind of suburban militia uniform. Professional cameras were set up to record the proceedings. She'd even brought what appeared to be a court reporter. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, calling the meeting to order with theatrical formality. "Tonight we address a situation that has threatened our community's welfare for far too long. Before we proceed with our legal resolution, Mr. David Harrison has requested time to address the board." I stood up slowly, carrying a single manila folder to the front of the room. The crowd's murmur died to complete silence. As I positioned myself behind the podium Margaret had set up for her victory speech. "Thank you for accommodating this emergency meeting," I began, making eye contact with faces throughout the crowd. "I think it's time we cleared up some fundamental misunderstandings about Clearwater Valley." Margaret leaned forward, probably expecting some kind of surrender or plea for mercy. "First, let me address the legal action you're threatening. Margaret, you mentioned documented violations that endanger community welfare. I'm curious about the legal basis for that claim. The HOA has clear authority to protect community standards." "Actually, you don't." I opened my folder and pulled out the first document. "According to county records, the Clearwater Valley HOA has jurisdiction over properties within your 3 residential developments. That's approximately 240 acres total." I looked around the room. The Harrison Ranch encompasses 2,847 acres, none of which fall under HOA authority. Property boundaries don't override community welfare concern, but they do override your legal standing to take any action whatsoever regarding our ranch operations. I pulled out another document. This is a cease and desist order from the county attorney's office, delivered this afternoon to your association's registered address. You are prohibited from further interference with ranch operations, blocking access roads, or harassing our employees. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Margaret's confident expression faltered for the first time. "However," I continued, raising my voice slightly, "that's not why I asked to speak tonight. I'm here because your association has raised some valid points about community welfare and property value." Margaret looked confused. This wasn't going according to her script. "See, while you've been focused on eliminating our ranch, I've been reviewing my family's complete property holdings in this valley. And you're right, it's time for some changes." I pulled out a geological survey map and held it up for everyone to see. This shows the natural gas deposit under our south pasture. Small-scale operation, but with modern extraction technology, quite viable. The room went dead quiet. "I've been in discussions with Apex Energy Solutions about developing this resource. They estimate an 18-month drilling and extraction timeline, followed by ongoing production operations." I smiled at Margaret's horrified expression. "Completely legal under mineral rights that predate all